Addressing Rakrak not as a tribal leader, but as the high priest who was closest to God, the stargazer asked what would happen when he died. Rakrak was silent. He wasn't sure either. The creatures told different stories. For the past few years, the black-cheeked lizardmen had been fighting great battles and warriors were dying. However, Rakrak could not understand where the souls of the dead went. At the funerals, he prayed for them to go to a good place, but there was no way to know if they had actually gone to a good place. At least not until he himself died. Where were they going? Were they dreaming because they were asleep? Maybe eternal sleep? Maybe they're having an eternal dream where they don't know who they are or why they're there and can't figure anything out. Stargazer looked worried, and so did Rakrak. Turning to Rakrak, he asked if he also thought that after death, eternal nightmares awaited them. A little hesitant, he replied that he wasn't sure. He was also not sure why he thought he was worthy of answering that question. The stargazer, on the other hand, had his own thoughts on the matter. The blue insect god had saved them when they were lost. And so he believed that he would guide them even after death. After expressing his speculation, he asked Rakrak if his thoughts were different from the actual god's will. The latter thought for a while. Although he did not know the exact answer to this question, he felt that he was completely right. Therefore, he answered that he was not wrong. After all, the blue insect god who had guided them all the time before, guided and helped them when they faced difficulties, would surely continue to guide them after death. Hearing this, the stargazer asked Rakrak with a somewhat satisfied expression what he thought the place he would go to after death would look like. He also asked dreamily if it would start with them standing before their god and awkwardly greeting him. After hearing this, a smirk appeared on Rakrak's face. He then replied that it probably wouldn't be that boring. Rakrak crossed his arms and added dreamily that in his opinion, there was going to be a huge space there. So you could run around in the green grass as much as you wanted. A space where every time you took a step, there would be a slight crunch and the tip of your tail would swish pleasantly through the meadow. In addition, there should also be a large boulder to rest on when you feel tired. And also a blue sky. Lots of sky. That one could stare at without stopping. Stargazer tried to visualize the picture Rakrak was describing. The image would bring a smile to his face. As he continued to put the picture together, he asked Rakrak what the weather would be like there. He replied that it would always have to be nice and sunny. After a second of thought, however, he added that it probably wouldn't, because it wouldn't be fun if it was all the same. He also added that it would be nice if there was a river. Stargazer stared upwards and said that he would like to have a house where he could rest. However, it should not be the tent he usually lived in before. After all, a tent conjured up associations of moving. He wanted a sturdy and cozy home where he could settle in and enjoy the views of all that beauty. The stargazer was also a guide, so Rakrak regretted not knowing sooner how the man felt. However, the stargazer had nothing against his former way of life. After all, he had found the place where his heart had settled, and so as long as he lived, he had no other grievances. However, what was to happen after death was a problem. The stargazer also inquired about the one's thoughts on food. Looking at the starry sky that was visible through the hole in the tent, Rakrak replied that he could probably eat as much as he wanted. Smiling at his words, the stargazer said that a place like that should probably really have everything. However, even with everything there, he thought that he would probably be lonely in such a large place. Rakrak shrugged his shoulders. In his opinion, there should have already been those who had gotten there before him. Because of that, he shouldn't be lonely there. Hearing that, Stargazer cheered up a bit. Another thing he was interested in was the stars. After all, they were something he had studied and been fascinated with throughout his life. Rakrak, who wasn't sure if there was an afterlife, answered affirmatively that there was. His certainty sounded so convincing, as if everything was obvious to him. After all, hadn't the stars been showing them the way all along? And most likely there would be those wandering there too, so God would surely have placed the stars in the sky so that they could easily find their way back. Suddenly, Rakrak's gaze was caught by a blue light coming from somewhere above. It was a blue butterfly that was glowing brightly. It slowly descended straight towards him. It was a sign. A reply from the blue insect god. A sign that he had heard them. Rak smiled, for it meant that the blue insect god was listening to their conversation. Rak slowly brought the butterfly's hand up to the stargazer's eyes so that he could see it more closely. Even so, he did not react. When he asked him if he could see it, he only replied that there was darkness before his eyes. Rak realized that the stargazer had already lost his sight and that death was coming closer and closer to him. He felt a pang of pity. The blue butterfly was known in the black sheik lizard tribe as a sign of positivity and wonder. Even if it wasn't the butterfly that glowed with a mysterious blue light, the lizardmen always rejoiced when they saw a blue butterfly, considering it a good sign. The stargazer would surely recognize it. Rak was tormented by memories of the time he and the stargazer had spent studying the stars playing games and how quickly time had flown by. Turning to him, he asked if he had been here. When he received a quiet affirmative answer, he whispered quietly in the stargazer's ear that he had brought him one last gift. When he heard that, he smiled. He asked if he was thinking of fooling around again. To which Rak replied that he wasn't going to let him refuse a gift again. "I'll find him right away this time," muttered the star catcher and smiled. When his last breath reached the blue butterfly, it flapped its wings and began to rise. Rak somehow knew it was his last breath. He gently shook the star catcher's body, calling his name. When he was sure he was no longer breathing, he called for the herbalist. The blue butterfly flew out of the tent and continued flying through the sky. It soared over a tribe of black-cheeked lizards, who were busily preparing for the gathering of the camp and the funeral. Then over the desert where dusk had fallen. Finally a blue butterfly landed on the back of his hand. It was Sunwon's hand. What happens when you die in the perished world? Sunwon knew the answer to this question well. The very next moment, a system window appeared in front of him, informing him that the conditions for creating an afterlife had been met and also asking if he wanted to do so. After reading the information, Sunwon did not hesitate to click yes. Sunwon knew that one day he would create an afterlife. After the player chose his first tribe and defeated the NPCs in the surrounding area, his divinity level would reach 11. This was one of the prerequisites for creating the afterlife, and the player could reach this level if he played correctly from the beginning. Then his subordinates could become demigods. Up to this point, he had managed to fulfill all the conditions for level, resources, and faith points. However, he still had a condition for the number of deaths. There were 4 conditions to create an afterlife. Reaching the required levels, killing NPCs such as abominations and fiends to obtain special resources, and obtaining enough faith points were the easiest of the 4. But the last condition, death, was unclear. It appeared that one had to achieve enough deaths of creatures that believed in the player and then the condition was considered met. However, there was no specific formula that could be used to determine how many creatures had to die in perished world, so players had to do the calculations and guess on their own. However, since the conditions had already been met, it didn't matter. Sun opened the World Creation Helper program. He knew that the day would come when he would create an afterlife, so he would occasionally simulate the different kinds of afterlife he wanted using the World Creation Helper provided by the perished world system, like the Creature Creation Helper that Sun had used to create his giant mantis. The World Creation Helper saved worlds that someone had created before, and worlds created by other players. But just like last time, Sunwon decided to create a new one. Even though he decided to create a new world, the basic settings remained the same, making it much easier. Sunwon already knew what kind of afterlife each species preferred from his previous experience with the game. Although lizards generally preferred the same type of afterlife, there was a certain type of world that the lizards of the young civilization particularly liked. Namely green fields with moist air and warm sunny plains. Someone felt somewhat relieved to hear Rak and Stargazer talk about the afterlife, for the afterlife he had created was not too different from their expectations. The afterlife was a very important element in the perished world, as the view of life after death for those who believed in a god depended on it. For example, if hell was created in the afterlife, the god could show the priests an image of hell through dreams. From the dreams, the priests would learn that the wicked would receive eternal punishment and would pass this fact on to other believers. The concept of heaven was also often used in conjunction with hell. But was there any point in believing in a god if hell was the only destination after death? Punishment should always be accompanied by reward. So a world had to be created in which believers believed they would go to heaven if they attacked a particular species or offended a particular god. And this was more than a matter of faith, since it actually took place in the afterworld. But for now, Sun One could not create an afterlife with heaven and hell. As a result, Sun One could only create one type of afterlife, which was called different worlds. Different worlds were useful afterlife worlds common throughout history. Valhalla, the waters of oblivion, Styx, limbo. They are all different, but they all denote worlds that one can go to after death. These worlds were not necessarily separate worlds, but were most often used as spaces leading to other afterlives. However, this was not the only purpose of these worlds. Even in Valhalla, the afterlife was like a training ground for warriors preparing for Ragnarok. Afterlife worlds can really be different, depending on how players want to use them. If I recall, Sun even won by using the afterworld well, but at that time, he was just lucky. Souls were immortal as long as the afterlife existed. Using the knowledge or powers that souls possessed was difficult as it took a lot of faith points, but as the game progressed in the later stages, immortal souls became very useful to players. Nevertheless, he decided that there was no need to rush things from the beginning. Many things were still in the planning stages. Sun One called his afterlife First Prairie. It was a working title, giving room for future expansion. The First Prairie then appeared beneath Sun One's feet and could be seen in the World Creation Assistant. He opened the window of his domain and scattered all the souls into the First Prairie. Hundreds of souls turned into blue wandering butterflies and landed on the endless sunny meadow. One of the butterflies was a stargazer, who was now awake. Even though his eyes were still closed, he could still feel the breeze blowing gently against his skin. The freshness of the air he inhaled seemed painfully familiar. Stargazer blinked. He thought death would be eternally sleepy, but when he opened his eyes, he felt rested for the first time in a long time. He lay there, his arms, legs, and tail moving the way he wanted them to. He never thought the pain in his joints would ever subside, not even in his sleep. The star catcher sat up. Immediately an amazing view opened up before him. It was a green meadow. A light wind blew past, and the star catcher felt the moist but cool air on his nose. At first he thought his nose was cold, but soon he felt the warmth of the sun on his face. All was well. Stargazer had no trouble remembering his last conversation with Rak. The conversation seemed like a dream to him, but at the same time so real and vivid. Rak, you were right. This is the prairie we envisioned. But there are no stars or houses of stone here. You can't always get what you wish for. There was a chance the houses in this place wouldn't be needed. Besides, this little thing didn't compare to what he'd already gotten. Stargazer couldn't help but smile. After all, it was truly a wonderful gift for him. Enjoying the pleasant sunlight, the Stargazer hummed a tune. The afterlife was much more pleasant and better than he had imagined. In addition, thanks to it, his long-time dream had come true, and he could finally relax in the sun. At some point, however, something caught his eye and made him turn around. As it turned out, he was not the only one who was on this green field. Here and there on the grass lay other lizardmen. They were sleeping facing the sky with their eyes closed. Stargazer was surprised, but he was more interested in why they were not awake yet. He wandered around, wondering if he should wake up the other lizardmen or not. The lizardmen looked like they were sound asleep, so it was rude to wake them up. Among the other lizardmen, the Stargazer saw a few familiar faces. Looking at one of the familiar lizardmen, he recognized him as one of his students and warriors. He remembered that he had been one of his arithmetic students and had died a few years ago in one of the many wars. One day, the black-clawed lizards had been attacked by an alliance of goblin tribes, 4 times the size of Rak's clan. 2 groups of goblins split the Rak clan's formation into 2. Rak, who was in front, and Ur, who was behind, brought their warriors back into formation and began to fight back. However, the children and old men who were in the center of the lizard formation could not do the same. All they had to do was hope for reinforcements and run away since they couldn't fight. But the goblins took that chance and ambushed them. Stargazer, who had seen many battles, realized that they had no way out. And the fact that the goblins were aiming at a place in the formation where there were mostly old men, women, and children was a common military trick. Their only option was to retreat and hold out until Rakrak's reinforcements arrived. The enemy had a numerical advantage, and their tribe's warriors were slowly continuing to be pushed back. The result of such a battle had to be one thing: a loss. In such a situation, the Stargazer realized that they were powerless, and this was their end. The goblins were already approaching them, about to massacre them. However, some of the warriors went against the leader's order, because they thought it was necessary, and abandoned the battlefield, and came to the defense of the old men and children. They were few in number, and did so after making sure that without them, the formations would not be broken. They apologized to their comrades and rushed to their aid, despite the fact that the goblins were dozens of times more numerous than they were. Each knew their lives were on the line, but they couldn't risk the future of their tribe just like that. Thanks to the lessons of the Stargazer, they knew how to count, and now it seemed to them a reasonable price to pay to save many others at the cost of one life. It was then that one of the warriors turned to the Stargazer and said that he was glad that he had learned to count and he was grateful to him for these lessons. The Stargazer could not stop him. He was firm in his resolve, as were several other lizard warriors. They had disobeyed the chief's orders to come here to help because they thought it was the right thing to do. And thanks to their heroic sacrifices, which no one wanted, the weak Lizardmen were able to escape and wait for the reinforcements, which by then had already managed to defeat the main forces of the Goblin Tribal Alliance. But that precious time was bought at a high price. Some of those brave warriors survived their heroic act, but most did not. The lizard warrior standing in front of the Starcatcher was one of those who did not survive. At the funeral of the warriors who had fallen in that battle, Rakrak went into a rage and began yelling at those who survived, and even those who died at their own funerals. He even yelled at the Stargazer. He was sure it was all because of that damn arithmetic he had taught them. The Stargazer himself realized some of his guilt, but still asked why he thought it was because of arithmetic. Rakrak thought so, for it was those warriors who were smart and good at arithmetic who had gone against his orders and rushed at the goblins. From the outside, they seemed so stupid, especially when they said that by sacrificing one life, they were saving two. They decided that it was a good exchange. However, none of them paid attention to the fact that old men and children can't protect others, but warriors can, and by dying themselves they leave the tribe defenseless. Then the Stargazer looked at him incredulously and asked, "So you think the warriors were wrong to face the goblins who tried to attack the old men and children?" Rakrak hesitated for a moment and answered, then the Stargazer asked why he was angry. Rakrak gritted his teeth and replied that he was angry for one simple reason. Because they were not wrong. And now he could do nothing else but be angry that they had died for their right decision, and he had been wrong then, but realized it too late. What irritated Rakrak the most, however, was what happened after that. Someone had apparently overheard the conversation between Rakrak and the Stargazer, and all the other warriors who didn't care about arithmetic at first went to the Stargazer to learn it. From then on, the warriors who were good at arithmetic always died in the front ranks when a battle arose and always made all sorts of sorties uncoordinated with the chief. And then others went to the Stargazer to learn arithmetic and so on in a circle. So later the Stargazer taught them secretly, trying not to annoy Rakrak even more. The warrior sleeping soundly in front of the Stargazer was the one who first led many other warriors of the clan to learn arithmetic. After him, even those who were not at first at all interested in arithmetic began to come to the Stargazer in secret and learn it. He inspired many by his example. Glad to meet the warrior, the Starcatcher put his hand on his shoulder, but withdrew it for fear of waking the warrior. Still, how glad he was to see him here. He decided to wake him later, when he had gotten a good night's sleep. After all, it didn't seem like there was much else to do in this place besides sleep anyway. Looking around, the Stargazer assumed that he had woken up faster than the others because he had recently died, and the others were still reeling from the lingering effects of death. Still, he was surprised that there was only an endless sea of grass, and that was all. He wondered, wasn't there anyone divine in this place? Anybody at all? He said it loudly, but his voice just dissolved into the endless green field. Stargazer hesitated. He wasn't as bold as Rakrak and the other warriors, and was a little shy, thinking that the god might overhear. Even when Rakrak pointed out that the Stargazer was one of the chosen, he didn't know what to make of it. He couldn't understand why him and what was so special about him that God had chosen him among the others. There were many questions in his mind. Why did the blue insect god save them, protect them, and help them with miracles? Yer said it was because lizard people were better than other species. But is that really the case? The other species seemed to lose either because they didn't have a god, or their gods weren't as powerful as their own. Owen said it was because the god was good. But how are lizardmen better than other species? Are other species not as good-hearted as us? JL said that God chose the lizardmen because they were helpful. Then was it right for them to rely on God? What if one day they stopped being useful? Stargazer thought Rakrak's answer was the best among all the others. Even if he wasn't right, Rakrak always offered answers that Stargazer liked. Rakrak said that the fact that God had chosen them could have been a coincidence. That maybe they had no choice but to be the best species in the best land. Maybe God did the best he could, and they were simply the best option among those available. It sounded disrespectful in a way, but the Stargazer thought it was okay. It was getting hot after being out in the sun for so long, but there was shade in the forest that had discreetly appeared not too far from the field. This place really had everything. He started humming because he was in a good mood. It was the tune everyone sang after the black-cheeked lizards defeated the frogmen and the villages were rebuilt. It had a good rhythm, so everyone liked it. But Stargazer didn't always hum it because he wasn't very good at singing. He was even embarrassed to hum it, so he only did it when no one was around. And then he heard a rustle. Suddenly, some movement caught his eye. Someone nearby was moving among the trees. The Stargazer began to wonder who it was. He saw the tail of a lizard sticking out between the trees. But he never got an answer from it. The tail swayed back and forth and then disappeared. He immediately called out to it again, but there was no answer. Then he began to rise hastily, intending to get close to the stranger and catch him if necessary. He began to ask the stranger to stop and listen to him, for he only wanted to ask him one question. Movement meant that someone was still awake. Who was it then? Could you be someone he knew? Not getting an answer, the Stargazer hastily got up and went into the forest. And soon he saw the tail again between the trees in the distance. But the tail disappeared when the Stargazer called out to him. He began to walk faster, thinking he might lose the lizard man. Walking fast was awkward, for he hadn't been able to do it until now and had gotten used to it. But then the Stargazer decided to remember his youth and started to run, and soon he was running after the lizard man, whose tail appeared and disappeared among the trees. Stargazer remembered that when he was young, he liked to run like that. As a child, he had run with a friend whose face and name he no longer remembered. He shouted after the stranger, "Stop! Where are you going?" Stargazer didn't feel so bad as he ran after this lizard man. His tail was leading him somewhere. When he passed a few bushes, a small clearing showed up. What he saw there made him excited. There stood a stone building. The Stargazer had never seen such a building before. The building was cylindrical, made of rectangular stones with a domed ceiling. The tail swayed back and forth at the entrance to the building and suddenly disappeared. As if disappearing inside. Stargazer thought that if there was any deity here, he had one question he'd really like to ask. Besides, the lizard man who was always running away from him and brought him here must have been inside the building as there were no other exits. As he approached the entrance to the building, he was thinking for the 100th time, why had God chosen them? Stargazer, whose body was hot from running, quickly climbed the steps and entered the building. A blue light burned at the end of the dark corridor. This light was familiar to the Stargazer. As he entered, he kept wondering why they were chosen. Was it because the Lizardmen race was better than the others? Or was it simply because of the divine benevolent? Or just because they were useful? He didn't know the right answer, but he really wanted to find out. Stargazer walked down the corridor where the blue butterfly led him. As always in his pondering of this question, he decided that Rakrak's answer was the most appropriate. He thought that perhaps it was just a coincidence and not a spur-of-the-moment choice. And perhaps it was simply the result of the best possible choice under the circumstances. It wasn't a bad thing after all. Finally he found himself face to face with the night sky. The very night sky of the world he knew was projected on the ceiling. The stars were not drawn but real, shining on their own. And the depth of the dark sky was no different from the real one. The sight took his breath away. He thought, well, you were right, Rakrak. A big stone house, and now the stars. Stargazer looked around for the master of the tale he was chasing, but the building was empty. However, Stargazer's attention was already on the night sky, not the tale. He scanned it from one end to the other and realized that the sky was moving exactly as he remembered. He believed that God was moving the night sky exactly as it moved. But this was not the end of it. In the center of the room stood a strange mechanical device that looked as if it could be found in the ancient ruins. It was a long cylinder of brass, with a round crystal beaker inserted at either end. It was mounted on a platform with a chair to sit on, its whole appearance silently inviting one to look into the strange device. For a moment, the Stargazer froze, wondering if he could touch the device. He decided that he could, since no one was around. After touching various parts of the device, he turned his gaze to the bottom crystal glass. He looked at it and couldn't contain his delight. Oh my God, how can this be? Stargazer stepped away from the crystal glass several times to look at the night sky with his naked eye and looked into the glass again. Cylindrical-shaped device. He couldn't believe that this was what the stars really looked like. Gradually though, he came to that conclusion. This is exactly what they looked like. This star would go this way and this one would go that way. His calculations were very rudimentary, but he checked it over and over again, and recalculated it over and over again to be absolutely sure. Now he was sure that everything he knew before was so superficial. How much more he had to learn. Stargazer stared uninterruptedly through this mechanical device, never tiring of it, as a thought suddenly occurred to him. It would be wonderful if he could pass this knowledge on to those still alive. That would be truly amazing. He didn't even notice that Sun Woon himself was standing behind him, watching him closely. According to the Stargazer, knowledge of the stars was a way of calculating, and if a person could calculate, he could determine the size and location of everything in the world, which would allow him to predict what would happen in the future. But as far as the Stargazer could remember, there had never yet been a case of anyone from the dead coming back. Then if one cannot return after death, why did God create this place? Just to see the old Lizardman be happy. Stargazer knew it couldn't be. God always does everything to his best advantage. He does nothing for nothing. This knowledge would surely come in handy in the future. The God that the Stargazer wanted to meet all along was standing right behind him, and he was quite pleased with the way the Stargazer followed him. The Stargazer's assumptions proved to be correct. After all, the afterlife would affect the views on life itself, life after death, and the values of those who believed in their God. If warriors went to the afterlife, their kind would dream of Valhalla, Valhalla. And if immortals with special powers went to the afterlife, their kind would dream of a beautiful, peaceful, and flourishing place. What if a scientist went to the afterlife? Then it would definitely lay the groundwork for thorough research and discoveries that would lead to technological breakthroughs. The afterlife would sometimes change and lead to unforeseen results due to attacks from other players. But for now, the afterlife created by Sun Woon was starting out perfect and functioning as it should. Sun Woon cast one last glance at the Stargazer's back before descending from the platform and exiting the first observatory he had built himself. At the same time, in the real world, the Klipdeer tribe that possesses superior ironworking technology over what the Lizardmen had at their disposal. In addition, they had managed to tame the fearsome saber-toothed tigers and were now preparing for a major war. The development and behavior of this tribe of gnolls was unusual. And it unmistakably indicated that there was also a player behind their actions. He had his own plans, and his own strategy, and for sure many trump cards up his sleeve. So Sun Moon had a lot to prepare before going to war with the other players, and this one specifically. It was going to be an exciting battle of wits and strategies on the chessboard, with the price of error being the highest. Now that Sun One had an afterlife, he should have tackled the next point of his plan, and prepare an appropriate reception for those pesky gnolls. To crush them once and for all and make them just another stepping stone on his lizard tribe's path to complete dominance in this world.